Ready when you are, sir.
Nice. All right, and we are live. Welcome to another Terraform Thursday. Today with the SDK team, with Katie Moe and Patty Carver. Hello, you two, and thank you for coming back. Before we get to introductions, quick shout out to our community guidelines. So we have a couple of rules here. Be welcoming, inclusive and friendly, be considerate, be respectful and be professional. Just be the best version of yourself that you can be, that you know you can be, and we know you can be. If you have questions for us, engage with us in the chat, drop them in there. We'll try to answer them to the best of our abilities. Things like, what was your favorite concert before, this all happened, and things like that. And if you want to read more about our community guidelines, head on over to hashicorp.com/community guidelines and read them, but not right now. Right now, we're doing introductions. So with that, Katie, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Katie Moe. I'm a senior software engineer, and I'm on the Terraform plugin SDK team, along with Patty.
I'm going to take that as my cue. Hi, I'm Patty Carver. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm also on the Terraform plugin SDK team at HashiCorp.
Beautiful. Thank you both for joining us. How'd you like my floating head on there?
That was so cool. Can I have one?
I actually have no idea what happened here, but technology is marvelous like that, which is why we're talking about the SDK and plugin framework today.
It's totally the same thing.
It's absolutely the same thing. Like what we do every day is we get up as a team and we're like, how can we put more floating cream heads on things this week? Like we need them everywhere.
That is, I know my mom will support that. I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of that, but I appreciate the effort that's being made here. With that in mind, so we had both of you and Brian at HashiTalks Build a month ago. If you missed that, can you give our audience a little bit of an insight in what you talked about?
Do you want to take this one, Katie, or shall I?
Go ahead, Patty.
You sure? All right, I'm counting on you to catch me if I miss something here. HashiTalks Build, that was like a lifetime ago. At HashiTalks Build, we announced the Terraform plugin framework, which is a new way to build Terraform providers. If y'all have been longtime viewers, first of all, thank you. But second of all, you'll notice we've been talking about Terraform Plugin Go, which is a very low-level kind of interface to building providers directly against Terraform's provider development interface and protocol. We announced Terraform Plugin Framework, which is more of an SDK equivalent. It's the higher level abstractions for building Terraform providers. And it's not at full parity of features with the SDK yet, but it's got a bunch of new ideas and abstractions built into it that we're really excited about. And you can find more information about what those trade-offs are on the docs site for terraform.io. And we're hoping to kind of bring more feature parity to that in the near future.
And we'll get a link for that shared in the chat, so you don't have to Google that.
Yeah, I think the talk was really interesting because we went into some of the sort of design principles and how we came up with this SDK equivalent, as Patty said. So Terraform plugin framework does a lot of the same things the SDK was able to do and more. So you might wonder, why did we basically do this massive rewrite? And in the talk, we go into some of the design principles that we wanted to use in the design of the framework, and also just kind of give a little bit of history of the SDK and how we got to this point. So things like being unit testable, making it so that your provider code can have unit tests as well as acceptance tests. That was one of our goals. So yeah, I really recommend looking at that talk to learn more about that.
Making things testable is nice, right? It gives us the confidence that the stuff we're building actually works outside our heads. I'm very much enjoying that.
Yeah, exactly. And being able to do that without running acceptance tests that take 24 hours to run, like some of the major cloud provider acceptance tests, that's a huge thing, and is something that you'll only really realize is an issue when you're developing these big providers. So being able to unit test smaller parts of your code is actually a hugely impactful thing for lots of provider developers.
And I think it's,
go ahead.
Sorry. I think one of the things to say there too is as we were building this and as we were kind of designing it, we were talking to other provider developers, and we watched some provider developers build their providers. And one of the things that stood out to me was how much code you need to write before you know whether anything works when you're building your provider. You've got to build up the provider schema, the provider configuration. You need to do create, read, update, delete, and the provider schema and the schema for the resource. There's a lot of code that goes into that. And so one of our goals with this was, how can we get you a quicker feedback cycle sooner? How can we start getting you into feedback on the state of your provider as you're building it sooner? And I think that making things unit testable really helps with that, because now the amount of code you need to write is you can literally write a create function and get feedback immediately on whether or not that works the way you thought it does. And I thought that was a really neat thing that kind of that the framework enables. One of my favorite things about the framework is I've been writing Terraform providers for what feels like an eternity. So old. But I've been writing Terraform providers for a while now, and I'm kind of set in how I think about them in terms of development, where there's a workflow in my mind for it. And what I didn't expect about the framework was when you're building with the framework, that workflow gets turned on its head and gets changed. And I actually really like the workflow that you use with the framework. It becomes a little bit more like writing other Go code than provider development with the SDK v2 had been for me. And so I didn't realize that was going to be something that the framework was going to bring to the table. But as we were building providers to test out the framework and stuff like that, that's an impact that I really kind of appreciated and was surprised about it. I keep saying in our private team channels things like, wow, this is going to be so great. I'm so excited about everything we're doing because I just did this thing and it was so exciting. But yeah, I'm super excited about it.
I mean, first of all, thank you for all the providers you've contributed to, because as a user, I'm sure I've benefited from that. We're at 1,300 something providers right now in the registry. So anytime you build something as fundamental to those providers as the plugin framework and the SDK, it's hugely impactful. I just want to say there's this tiny marketing blurb in there. We took the test from 24 hours to 24 seconds. I want to say that could work out nicely. That being said, you mentioned that you looked at other provider developers, what they were doing, how they were going through it. What's your favorite don't that you came across where you thought, hey, you're doing this and it's very confusing and you should probably not, simply because of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, I think Paddy's going to have another good answer to this, because he's watched someone streaming their provider development experience, which is extremely interesting. I didn't catch the whole of that, so I'm just going to say not checking your errors when you set your resource data. I mean, one of the things the old SDK lets you do easily and get away with is not check when you have an error. And that can lead to problems down the line. But I think Paddy's going to have more interesting examples here, because he's actually seen this live.
Yeah, and I think we also we come across a lot of stuff in the Discuss forum, and we come across a lot of stuff in issues too. So even people that don't live stream their provider development, we still kind of get feedback from them. And of course, we talk to all of our internal provider developers at HashiCorp a whole bunch too. But yeah, I did watch the fire hydrant provider being built on a live stream, and that was just an incredibly valuable experience. If anyone out there is building a Terraform provider and wants to live stream that, drop me a note, tell us about it, please, because we will show up. And first of all, I'll be in your corner during that development process as much as I can be. But second of all, it's just incredibly valuable for us to be able to look over your shoulder as you build providers, and we can kind of see what you're struggling with and kind of help solve those problems. My favorite problem that the framework addressed, that's a really tough one. I'm gonna pick two. I'm gonna pick two because I'm a rule breaker and don't follow directions well. My first one is the move away from resource data. Resource data in SDK v2 is this amalgamation of the plan, the config, the state, and it's all balled up into this one thing. And it's got it's kind of like a black box of behavior there that kind of creates a lot of knock-on effects for people. And so I'm really excited that we've kind of moved away from that abstraction into abstractions that are more, that we feel are more appropriate for provider developers. So we surface config, state, and plan as separate things so that you can see what's going on and can kind of follow the rules Terraform has set down a bit better. But also the way you access that data, you no longer get it as an empty interface that you need to type assert against. You now have these this helper that will allow you to either get a specific attribute or get the entire value as a Go object following conversion rules, the same way that JSON on Marshall works, and in following some of those Go best practices. And I'm actually it's a small thing, it's a subtle thing, but I'm really excited about that because it feels cleaner and nicer to me when I'm developing a provider to not be doing type assertions all the way. And as SDK developers, it gives us a lot more flexibility about how we structure things internally going down the road. We've definitely had problems before where we wanted to change the type that we were using to represent something internally inside that resource data. And we couldn't because it would break everyone that was type asserting against it, which is basically everybody. So it definitely gives us a better compatibility posture there. So I'm super excited about that. The other one that I wanted to talk about, which isn't really a problem that people talk about, or like I think that registers as a problem to people, it's going to sound like a feature, but I think of it as a problem, is we created types, but the types are just filling an interface. So we've got the ability to have provider defined types now, and the ability to bundle up plan customization and validation logic into your own type that you can then reuse and kind of make this reusable component of a resource. And we worked really hard on this, and it added a lot of complexity to our design process, which Katie will definitely back me up on. Katie and I have spent weeks talking to each other about like, how are we gonna, but we need to do this, but we need to do that. How does this all work? We can't rely on just knowing that it's going to be one of these types anymore. We've got to actually build out all of the interfaces to that we need. But I think it's super powerful, the ability to have, for example, a JSON type that will just behave correctly. And you don't need to redefine that for every attribute for all of your different resources and data sources. You can define it once and then use it everywhere and then kind of iterate on that. And I think, again, this kind of goes back to, this is just like writing regular Go code where you can create and develop these abstractions for your provider that then you can test and can use and can have things be a little bit less copy and paste and a little bit more engineered, if that makes sense.
So I think Paddy took the question about what I interpreted as a question about bad practices or worst practices, and talked about cool stuff you can do in the new framework. And so I actually want to tag on another answer there because when we talk about kind of bad practices or things people shouldn't do in the SDK, really they are doing the best they can within the limitations of what they're given and with the framework they're given. And so part of writing a good framework, as Paddy alluded to earlier with his comments about being Go idiomatic, is empowering people to use these tools in the best way they can and making that totally natural. So in that vein, one of the things I also like about the new framework, as well as the things Paddy mentioned, is just that it really kind of mirrors the shape of the Terraform protocol itself. So now that you're able to do validation and plan modification or plan customization, as we've called it, we've sort of aligned those things to the RPCs that they actually really correspond to. Because under the hood, Terraform is sending the provider lots of RPCs, and they're called things like plan resource change, apply resource change, validate resource config, and things like that. So while we didn't want to totally expose all the complexity of that in the framework, if you want all that complexity, you can use Terraform plug and go. We did want to make sure that we were not adding our own abstractions over that complicated it, but rather that just allowed you to hook into those RPCs. So for example, if you want to add a validator or add a validate step in your resource, then that is just hooking into that validate config RPC. And if you just read about how that works in the framework, then you'll see it's quite clear at what point in the protocol kind of conversation that happens. So one of my favorite things about the new framework and the kind of best practice it enables is just making it clear at what point your code is actually going to be run.
Which is a useful point of insight, I would argue. So
yeah, if you're using customized diff in the old SDK, it's really tricky to understand when Terraform is going to run that code, when the SDK is going to run that code. And if you look at the documentation for that, you'll see that, I mean, we do our best to go into as much detail as we can, but you've got to make it so that if you run it twice, then it will have the same result each time under certain conditions and things like that. And it's not very clear to the developer why you need to do that or how to do that.
Having the same result twice or as many times as I run the code, I like this.
I'm going to refer you to the documentation there and not try to explain all of the requirements for customized diff on this live stream.
It's probably good because I have a different question. So we talk to a lot of users and some of them are advanced enough that they need or want their own provider. I think that's always good. That's how the registry got so big. That's how Terraform got so useful. If you're starting out a new provider right now, if you're using the plugin framework, I believe you have to be on Go 1.16 at the very least. What other things should somebody keep in mind? What's something that you think, hey, this is definitely something that, we should probably have in the docs, but, imagine you're seeing me live stream the coding process of that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes because I love that invite that you gave to our community here. That is very cool. But what's one thing that makes you think, hey, I really want to have that, I want to point that out?
Yeah, I also want to highlight that the earliest supported Terraform version for a provider made using Terraform plugin framework is 1.03. So if your provider for some reason needs to work with Terraform versions earlier than that, then you can't use plugin framework.
Yeah, that's what I was going to call out. Technically, our official support policy for the SDKs, for all of our SDKs really, is to use the last, is that we support what Go supports, which is the last two major versions of Go. And so I believe Go 1.17 is out now, which means that currently we support Go 1.16 and Go 1.17. When Go 1.18 comes out, we will support Go 1.17 and Go 1.18. And so we test against those. We may accidentally support other things, but we may start relying on other features that are available only in our supported versions at any point, and we won't consider that a breaking change. That's kind of our support policy for Go. I think what Katie mentioned is the bigger kind of concern here, which is 1.0.3 is a more restrictive, is going to be the more restrictive kind of requirement, that it only works with providers built on that. And that's because we based it on a new version of the Terraform protocol that allowed us to offer a better provider developer experience. And that shipped with Terraform 1.0.3. So that's the other thing to know. But really, a lot of the points around which SDK should I use, and is the framework ready for me to use it yet? All of that, I really think people should check out the page on Terraform.io. We wrote about that, which goes to in great detail, more detail than we can go into on this live stream, about what is ready, what the difference between the SDK and the framework is, what the plan is for all of that, and it kind of answers those questions as much as possible. And if you do have a question about it, or if that page leaves you confusion about something, I personally at least would really appreciate an issue either on the SDK v2 repo or the framework repo asking that question, so we can get it added to that document and kind of keep our docs the most useful place for that kind of information possible.
I think that's a great call out. In terms of feedback, anytime, dear viewer, if you have feedback, find one of us, either on Twitter, on GitHub issues, somewhere, and let us know. Because if you're running into something, the chance that you're the only person running into that is about 0%. There's no rounding error here. More people are going to run into this, and we want to make this a great experience for you. If you're following along on YouTube, we've got the link to which SDK you should use in the chat. It is very nicely written. It answers all the questions that we think you might have. So it's definitely, it is helpful knowing, you know, like, hey, this is what you're getting into. And yeah, 1.03 came out, I want to say, just before HashiTalks build. I think it was the Tuesday or the Monday before. So it's only been out for a month. If you're writing your own provider, try to be on 1.x. It's going to bring you stability for your end users that we weren't able to promise before. Not to say that previous Terraform versions weren't stable, but 1.x has a different promise in terms of stability. It definitely helps. I know last time around we had the question, which cupcake the SDK is. We're not doing that today because cupcake names are just confusing to most people. I ran into this today. But support policies. End of life for the V1 was July 31st. What does it mean if, and I know some of this is answered on the which SDK page to use. What does it mean if I'm running a version of an older unsupported version of the provider? Will my code suddenly stop working?
That's a trickier question to answer than you might believe. So we wrote about this in the Discuss forum when we were making SDK v1 end of life. What end of life really means is that we will not be testing SDK v1 for compatibility with new Terraform releases anymore, and we will not be resolving feature requests or bug fixes for SDK v1 from this day forward, or from August 1st forward. And so what it does not mean is that any previously published providers built on SDK v1 will break because of this change. But if Terraform makes a change that is incompatible with SDK v1, those providers will break at that point, and that is a situation that falls outside of our support guarantees for resolving. So there is no guarantee that we will take action or cut an SDK v1 release to fix it at that point. So yeah, if you're on, sorry, go ahead, Katie.
No, go on, please.
If you're on SDK v1, my personal recommendation is to make upgrading to SDK v2 a high priority for you at this point.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with all of that. And also in our support.md document, we also link to the upgrade guide. So you can, if you're concerned about how much work it is to upgrade from version 1 to version 2 of the SDK, we've got a whole guide there. We've got a little bit of automated tooling which will help rewrite your import paths and things like that. So we hope that it won't be too much work to upgrade to v2 of the SDK. And as Paddy says, since we're no longer testing against new versions of Terraform, while there won't be any sudden changes to the SDK, as he says, if Terraform releases a new version that happens to be incompatible with providers built using V1 of the SDK, then your provider would suddenly break relative to those versions of Terraform.
As an end user, I feel like for end users, sorry, I should call out that Terraform has a log file feature since version 14. You should definitely be using that just to make sure that you're always pulling in the providers that you used and tested. Terraform providers are pulled from the registry. They're pulled from Git, depending on how you set up your operations. You might have a local network mirror. Files can be replaced. Git tags can be recreated. If you don't have a hash to compare to, version 1.0.1 of the provider you downloaded a month ago might not be the same that you get today. That's why hashes are useful. Commit the log file. We had a great discussion about this the other day on Twitter with a couple of users that were wondering about the same thing. Our guideline is commit that file. There's no cost to that. It's a couple bytes extra, which in the grand scheme of things of your Git repository should definitely not be a problem. And it's worth it. It makes your Terraform end user experience a lot better.
I would also call out for practitioners, because I know this is a very scary sounding thing to practitioners whenever we say a bunch of providers are end of life. Existing Terraform versions that work with existing providers should not see any change. So using the required Terraform version, things like that, is a good way to make sure that this does not impact you at all. But it does mean you're not keeping up with the latest and greatest of Terraform and of the provider. So provider developers, it definitely helps practitioners if you can also help them keep up to date with the latest and greatest by adopting SDK v2.
I think that's actually a great call out. It's the stuff you have with a log file defined and required versions in there will keep working as long as the remote API doesn't change. Once the remote API changes, then that's no longer something Terraform can account for, unless it changes in ways that are compatible. Hard to say this will always work, but pin your versions and it will work longer. I think that's a fair promise we can always make.
Yeah. Yeah, this is why compatibility discussions with Terraform are always so hard, because it's like, I mean, we're not going to break any providers. I see no reasons providers wouldn't continue working, but kind of the point of the support policy is it defines when we guarantee that they will continue working and that we will continue to help make sure they work. We've reached the end of support policy. So what that means is you're kind of going out on a limb here of like, if it will continue working for now, probably, but like, how far out on that limb do you want to get is kind of how I look at it.
It's also just good practice to keep updating your code base, both for the provider and for Terraform, and make sure you get the new stuff in. If you're looking at our major providers for AWS, Azure, GCP, they have weekly releases, new resources and data sources being added, Terraform getting more useful because it now supports that one resource that your organization uses and wasn't supported before. There's many great reasons to update and very few to not. But there's always upgrade horror stories. So I want to know, Katie, what's one where you were like, hey, this should be a super straightforward update, no problems, and 3 days later you're still hating every second of it?
I don't know if I have a Terraform provider upgrade horror story. I mean, since I always pin my versions, I certainly don't. I'm asking about general upgrade horror stories.
In my head, this setup was going differently, but I like that your conclusion is I pin my versions, and so I don't have this problem. That's also a very good learning.
I mean, I have times when I've upgraded all the packages on my Linux machine and rebooted, and then the video driver doesn't work. I mean, I don't know if that's an upgrade horror story. It's just, life under Linux. So I have that surprisingly often.
Just let the record show that I didn't say that. Patty, what kind of troubles have you run into?
It wasn't an upgrade horror story that I experienced, but it's one that I caused. I've actually got two that I caused. So back, what was that, Katie?
I said that's even better. This is an even more fun story.
Yeah. So here's when I broke prod. No, so back in the day, Terraform and all of its providers were shipped as one single zip file. And so to cut a new release of a provider, you needed to cut a new release of all of Terraform. I, of course, had the bright idea the day before we released the new Terraform minor version to change the, I want to say I changed the authentication on the Google provider from optional to required to fix a bug, and ran the acceptance tests, and they all passed and everything was great, except for the caveat that the acceptance test didn't cover that code change, and I had never tried it manually using an actual binary. And so it crashed Terraform anytime you had the Google provider at all in your configuration or state. It would just immediately crash Terraform because I was using something nobody had tried before, and it did it, and it broke everything. And it was just during like a patch release. So everyone was like, it's going to be a super easy upgrade. It was not. So that was a fun one. We ended up releasing a patch to fix that. After we had them separated, the Google provider, I introduced a new a block for App Engine applications as like a sub block on the project resource, because of how the resources work in Google. It's not really important. But the important thing is like their serverless App Engine thing was set as a sub block on the project resource. And so I released it and had it so that if your App Engine block wasn't defined and there was one, the next Terraform apply you ran, it would just delete your App Engine app. And because that's how Terraform works. You're supposed to have everything in the config, and this all makes sense in my head, and this is all by the book. Great. Katie's smiling because she can see where this story is going. I released it, and users were very upset because it turns out that the first apply after they upgraded, they thought that I was like, oh yeah, it's a new resource. It was in fact a breaking change because it brought something else into the project scope. So you apply this, and it deleted people's App Engine accounts. And so that was not ideal either. But yeah, it's been interesting navigating Semver as a Terraform provider developer. Because what is an enhancement? What's a bug fix? What's a breaking change? What's interesting about Terraform providers is all of their state is technically an interface, because you can interpolate against any of it and the type of all of that state. So anything you want to persist as a provider is part of your public interface. And so the question of, is this a breaking change, is hard to answer, because technically almost everything is. But like in practice, what is actually going to break a user has been a fun thing to figure out. So
yeah, we were actually talking about this today. You know, what if you change what a provider outputs in the console, is that a breaking change, even if it's a very substantial change in what it outputs? And I mean, there's arguments on both sides. You could say, as Patty mentioned, you know, the state is part of the provider's API. The CLI output is perhaps part of the provider's API as well. And you may have people reading that in a script or otherwise depending on it, for whom that would constitute a breaking change. But on the other hand, and this is the option we eventually sort of went with, and this is the consistent position we usually try to stick to. In this case, the change would not have required the practitioner to change their config at all. The behavior of the provider, given the same config, would produce the same state in this case. It would maybe produce a different output in the console, but in this case, because what it was doing was actually fixing a bug with that console output, we did not consider that change breaking, in theory anyway. So I think that the sort of larger principle we're trying to aim at here is that semantic versioning is just a way of communicating to people what to expect and what actions they may need to take. So a breaking change means you will very likely have to change something about what you're doing as an end user of whatever this thing is. So if it's a provider, a breaking change means you're probably going to have to change your config, or you've got the same config but something different is going to happen, like all your app engines get deleted. That's pretty breaking. I'm sorry, Patty. But on the other hand, if the converse is that if even if something's technically kind of part of the output of your program, then I don't think the correct semantic interpretation of semantic versioning is that every time that changes, you need to bump your version, because, as I say, it's a way of communicating to the user. You need to pay attention now, or you need to take some action, or we fix something and it's kind of safe to upgrade, which I think is what a patch version communicates. It says it's safe and you should upgrade to this version.
And I think that's something that we on other providers, I'm going to say we, not we as in the people in this call, but we, the maintainers of those providers at that time. We've had to make hard calls before of like something is technically set in state, meaning technically somebody could be interpolating it somewhere and could be using it, but we need to change it. And do we consider that a breaking change? And sometimes we've said no, even though technically, and I know some of our people are going to get very mad at me about this, but sometimes we've been like, no, it's not a breaking change, because there is no use case we can think of for interpolating this somewhere. And so one of HashiCorp's principles is pragmatism. And so we were kind of like, we can stick to the rules of Sumver and not fix this right now because it's not time for a major breaking change yet. And we usually try and gather things up for major breaking change. And so people are going to have to live with this gnarly bug until then, or we could fix the gnarly bug now. And if someone is concocting a very weird, very bizarre config that somehow includes this in interpolation, their life's going to be bad for this one. But as we weighed kind of user harms of our options there, we ended up going with, let's ship it as a minor version as opposed to a patch version, and like call it out in the changelog or something like that, but not consider it breaking for Sumver purposes. And that seems to have worked well for us in the past. But I think we kind of usually leave that distinction up to providers. I know we just published a page recently on the Terraform.io site about how frequently to publish major breaking changes and things like that, and what HashiCorp's recommendations are for that. So if you've got more interest in Sumver and how we apply it to providers, that might be a good place to check out as well.
Also like the call out that essentially sticking to convention for the sake of convention doesn't make sense, right? If it's breaking and if affecting a large amount of users because you're returning all your app engines to the big cloud in the sky, then it's worth fixing that, even if it would be considered a breaking change. I like this. We had a couple of comments in the chat. First of all, if you still remember Terraform being a single binary, then you've been around for a while. Thank you. Let us know how your experience has been and what provider you're working on, because at this point, you're kind of required to write one. And if you live stream it, Patty will join you and help you and be in your corner. And this is honestly the coolest feedback that you can, the coolest offer that we've actually had, because that's the kind of feedback that is very hard to get, right? The person working on the technology you're using, sitting there with you. So I highly encourage you to write something, or expand an existing provider. I'm still hoping for the time where the Domino's provider will actually support multiple geos, so people outside the US can also use it.
I ran out of time for HashiTalks build, but that was going to be my demo provider for HashiTalks build, was to update the Domino's provider, clearly the most important provider that HashiCorp offers, to be using protocol version 6. But I ran out of time to make that dream a reality.
There will be future editions of HashiTalks build, and there will be more hungry people, both for knowledge and pizza. So that definitely works. So one of the questions that I have for the audience if you're joining us today, are you maintaining a provider? Are you thinking of building one? Are you considering that, hey, maybe provider development is the right place for us? Does your company offer an API that you think would be best consumed via Terraform? Let us know in the comments. I think that, to me, would be really interesting to see. And in the meantime, we had one question, which was, what are some of the lessons learned while you've worked on the different iterations of the SDK and the plugin framework for Terraform? Go with Katie.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question that we talked about this a bit in our HashiTalks build talk, and we've been talking a lot this year and last year about the lessons learned while working on the SDK. So yeah, this is a great question. So I mean, the SDK, what we call the SDK, the helper schema package, was added to Terraform 7 years ago, and so we've had quite a lot of time to think about these lessons learned. And so I suppose one thing that comes from such a long-running and widely used piece of software is just that when you put something in it, it's going to stay around for a while, and a lot of people are going to use it. And then if you want to remove or change that thing, then it's going to be tricky, and it's going to potentially cause people a lot of pain if you remove something they're using, even if you replace it with something better. So in an effort to mitigate that, we, for example, ended up adding new versions of the Crud functions, the create, read, update, delete functions on your resource. So in the SDK, there are now 2 sets of Crud functions that you could add to your resource. And what we've learned from doing that is that sometimes that can be a little bit confusing for people, and it comes along with trade-offs such as, if you want to, for example, warn people that the version of the function they're using is deprecated, then you may end up with unintended consequences like spamming their log files with every time a create function gets run, it spams with "this is deprecated," which might not help everyone. So deprecating functions, even if you do it in a nice and elegant way, is going to have a cost. So as with all software, I suppose, if you think something is going to be temporary, many of the times you assume that it's not going to be temporary, and so the things you build, unless you very deliberately put them in a way that you know and intend to change later, then people will end up relying on them, and you'll have to sort of build on top of that. So that's a general lesson that I think we're kind of learning over and over again as we build software. I have more, but I want to hear from Paddy first.
I do want to tack on to that. I think that's a great one, and kind of is my first thought too. But the nuance there that I want to kind of point to as well is that in the absence of a communicated support policy for something that works, people will assume that it works or that it is supported, which is surprising to me. But I would have assumed it was the other way around. But we hear all the time, this doesn't work in the latest SDK release. It worked in the last one. And I'm like, that is a totally bonkers thing. Where did you hear that you could do that? And they're like, well, I tried it and it worked. So I assumed it was fine. And I assumed it was supported. So make it work in this version too. And I'm like, that is not how I want to be writing software. But so one of the things that I think we've gotten a little bit more aggressive about in the last year or two is communicating what is supported and what is unsupported, and slapping unsupported labels on things. And I know people are find it scary that Terraform plugin framework and Terraform plug and go are 0x releases, and we're making no backwards compatibility promises about them yet. But I think it's important that we call that out, because we are trying to learn things and we are trying to iterate. And yeah, so that's kind of an expansion, I guess, on what Katie was talking about there, about people will rely on it forever. I guess the part I'm pointing to is it's like people rely on it forever, even if you don't say that they can or should. It's you got to explicitly tell people not to rely on something if you don't want them to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I remember an interesting case with the Terraform state file, which Terraform core doesn't consider part of their public API, but realistically, a lot of people are reading the Terraform state file for whatever reason with whatever tools. I remember one bug someone filed saying, my tool is broken because the order of resources in the state file has changed. And Terraform core team, their reaction was kind of baffled, like, oh, what, we had no idea that the order of things in that file mattered. We consider this a kind of ephemeral artifact of Terraform running. But yeah, I mean, it's that general spacebar heating problem, I suppose, the behavior that you as a developer can consider accidental or unintended will eventually get relied on if you have enough users, and Terraform core and the SDK have a lot of users.
I think that's also one thing to keep in mind, right? Initially, when the SDK was released very early on, it was practically built for internal users at HashiCorp and a handful of partners. Now we're serving a community of 1,346 providers, I just checked, that are on the registry alone. There's probably a couple thousand more on various places that we don't have visibility in. Saying yes to one feature means saying no to another feature and potentially upsetting thousands of end users that we didn't even know. So, I mean, thank you both for doing that, because that's not easy.
Thank you for upsetting thousands of people. You are welcome, Kareem. It is my pleasure.
But at the same
job I was born to do.
But at the same time, helping tens of thousands.
We hope so.
Because something doesn't break. So we had two interesting questions in the comments, and I'll summarize them as, let's say I'm an end user and my favorite provider is broken, which really means that I'm probably using my resource in the wrong way. Is there a way for me as an end user to enable debugging of a very specific resource without having access to the provider code? Because maybe I just get the binary, or maybe because I don't feel like running through it.
I've got thoughts on this, but Katie, if you've got any input, I'm interested in your input as well.
I mean, with the question as stated, I would recommend setting the TF log environment variable and then grepping the resultant log file. But if you're able to do things like modifying the provider code or using our new logging library, which I hope Paddy will talk about, then maybe there are more options there. But it kind of depends on the provider developer. So yeah, I'm interested in Paddy's answer here.
So my first hot take is always to give provider developers as verbose a log as you can. So TF log equals trace, fantastic. Always gives them that. The next step that you as a practitioner can do is isolate the problem as much as you can. The simplest possible reproduction you can get of the problem, where simple is both the fewest resources changing, but is also the smallest possible account setup. So like, we've definitely had people that are like, yeah, you need to set up this VPN and be behind this proxy and then do all of this, and that's my setup, and it breaks. And we're just like, we can't help you. I don't know. We can't replicate your setup here, and it works for us when not under your setup. So that's tricky. So yeah, the simplest possible reproduction, and then narrowing it down is really narrowing down what Terraform is doing at that point. If you can isolate the resource that you want, then you'll get the changes for that. I would send the provider developer everything. If you're feeling generous and it's reproducible, send them tflog equals trace, and then tflog equals trace with tflog core, I believe it is what it is, equals off, and that'll turn off the core logging and give them just the provider logging. And that's all kind of documented on the Terraform.io website and kind of what those environment variables are and what's supported there. But we've gotten a little bit of ability there. As Katie mentioned, there is a new logging package that we're working on that is due to be integrated with providers basically imminently. that allows us to filter logging based on provider. I don't know that we've got it based on resource just yet through environment variables, but we're hoping to have tooling for that use case in the near future.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that this question is asked from the practitioner perspective, because I can really see why you would want to do that as a practitioner. And so I think maybe there's a way we can encourage, well, I mean, so firstly, if a provider developer is using Terraform plugin log, which they will be able to do soon, and this is the new logging library we've been alluding to, they will be able to basically add ways to filter the logging by using an environment variable, or basically however they want to set that up. You know, you can have different places the logs go. So it is really up to the provider developer at this point. So if a provider developer wanted to say, allow you to set tf underscore log underscore my resource name, and for that to filter all the logs for that resource, that would currently be up to the provider developer. But I can see why you'd want that as a practitioner.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'll mention that I keep alluding to towards the future is there is tflog equals JSON, which gives you JSON parsable output from Terraform and from the logging that's a little bit more machine readable and filterable. We want to ship tooling that will allow ingest and use of these JSON logs so that provider developers have some more tooling available to them, that users can just be like, just here's everything, and the provider developer can filter the artifact after the fact. That's not quite
but you could do
ready
that as a
yet.
practitioner, though. Yeah, you could just get all those JSON logs, put them in, you know, Elasticsearch or something, or whatever you like to read your logs with. I think that's a great tip. Yeah, so you actually got structured logging now if you want it.
Yeah, I was actually going to suggest that if you're running Terraform in a CI/CD setup, just have it switched on, parse those logs, store them, and whenever problems arise, then you'll already have the data to figure out what went wrong.
I do just want to call out that the Terraform binary does not have, as we talked about, Sumver and compatibility. There are no compatibility guarantees about the format of the JSON right now. It'll be consistent within Terraform versions, but it can change at any time. And so really the only long-term supported way of interacting with those JSON log files is through tooling provided from a Terraform team, either core or from us. And that's not quite ready at the moment. But yeah, if you're just looking for a today I need this one hack, then that JSON output could help you. Just know that it might change its format in the future, if that makes sense.
I think because it's plain text, you'll still be able to find the information. Maybe your parser won't be as perfect, but having more information when debugging is always preferable to not having it. I just want to drop a call out here. I spoke to one of our provider developers a while ago. They had a user drop an issue on GitHub, very frustrated. But as Patty says, without giving us any code that shows what you're doing and just using words to describe it, we're not going to be able to paint the same picture, which means we're not going to be able to trace, no pun intended, what's happening here. So anytime you share a GitHub issue, include as much as possible. I know this sounds repetitive, but just do it. Strip out everything that's company specific. If you can post it on a public issue, there's plenty of services that you can use. Pretty sure you can use our public key to submit it to us in ways that only we can see it. Your secret as it is will be safe with us, and we'll help you figure out why something is breaking.
The very first step, though, we go through as provider maintainers, as SDK maintainers, the very first thing we do is try and establish a reproduction of that. And how long that we think that's going to take us and how involved that is for us really kind of impacts how quickly your issue gets resolved as well, because we've got a bunch of stuff to do. Everyone's got so many things to do all the time, both inside HashiCorp and out. But an easy reproduction where it's like, look, here's all of the setup work you need is really helps set your issue out above the rest and helps us get to it earlier because it's less of an investment for us. We can focus on the parts of our added expertise instead of chasing down different API credentials for different environments and setting up proxies and figuring out how to get the rest of the config that you omitted set up and all of that, and trying to build that reproduction and then hope at the end of that it exhibits the same problem you're talking about. Terraform version, provider version, config, whether it happens when you're creating a new resource or only happens when you're updating, all of that kind of information really helps us out.
I think that's the best call out that you can make, is be considerate of the people who want to debug, because we want to help, but don't make it incredibly hard. If we need your corporate VPN, including your smart card, we all know that that's not going to happen. I should also say we have a Learn tutorial on learn.hashicorp.com on how to debug your Terraform provider. That's currently for the older approach. It works. I think it starts with Terraform 0.14. But the skills you learn with that will translate to how you can do it with a provider that you're using with 1.03 and later. So I think it's time well spent in general. And anytime you pick up debugging skills, even if you're not a provider developer yourself, you're going to be making somebody happy when something eventually breaks because you're doing something that for us may have been not even an edge case, just not something we thought about. And for you, it would be your daily operations life.
So I know we are running out of time here and we are basically at the end of this. It's a little bit of a switch, but I did want to call out, first of all, we are always looking to hear from provider developers. We're always looking to understand our community and find better ways to reach you. Right now, the Discuss forum pipes right into our team channel. It goes straight to my inbox. It's a thing that we pay attention to. I know we can sometimes be delayed in answering there. We're trying to juggle community work and building things work. And sometimes we go on vacation, but because PTO is important and everyone should take PTO. But that's it's important to us that we're able to kind of talk to the people that we're building things for. On that note, I know we've been doing some user research studies and some stuff like that we kind of want to hear in more formal contexts from people. Is there any way people can express interest in joining a user research study, or should we just send them to Discuss and be like, hey, I'd be interested in joining this if you get a group together?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So we're currently preparing a survey to send out, which we will be publicizing through Discuss and through here and through all of the other channels we have available. So I encourage you to watch the space for that. There's also, you'll find that if you take any HashiCorp user research survey, that there's now a question on there about whether you use the SDK. So if you're already a HashiCorp research participant, then you'll sort of be you'll be invited to join our pool there. But we haven't yet got a kind of landing page for this, but we're going to be starting this project of firstly sending out a survey to provider developers to understand how they currently do acceptance testing and any pain points and things like that. And then we'll be expanding that into more in-depth surveys. But at the moment, if you want to have us look over your shoulder while you build a provider or things like that, then the best way is just to kind of contact us directly. Eventually, we're going to hopefully have a way of encouraging more people to do that, and also having other sorts of surveys and other ways of giving us structured feedback. So I would encourage you to watch out for a survey in the next few weeks.
Awesome. And my only addition is if you don't want to have us watch over your shoulder, if that makes you uncomfortable, you don't want to live stream it or whatever, even if you type up experience reports or things like that in the Discuss forum where you're like, hey, I built a provider, here's what was tricky for me, here's what I liked, here's here's how I thought it went. Those are incredibly valuable to us. Like those are so useful to us. We've kind of grown a large community of Terraform providers and provider developers that's very loosely connected, and we're trying to kind of bring some connection to that now so that we can talk to all of you and build things that are based in the problems that you're having and solving the problems everyone's having rather than the problems we are seeing, if that makes sense. So yeah, definitely any indication you can give us of what you're experiencing, what you're struggling with, things that you like, things, common patterns you see. Common patterns are amazingly helpful for us of like, I do this all the time. But yeah, Discuss would be a great place to just kind of post and give us that feedback too. But yeah, that's my other call out.
I think that's a great call. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing it on a public forum because maybe you're working on an internal provider, or maybe you don't want to announce that you're working on a provider, feel free to drop me an email. I don't know if you two feel comfortable sharing yours, but I'm Kareem at HashiCorp. Just drop me an email and I'll make sure Patty and Katie see it and get the feedback that they have. What you consider common patterns for your provider might not be the common patterns that everyone considers common. We can all learn from each other, and maybe you're running into the same exact problem everyone is. Talk about it and we'll figure it out together. With that, thank you all for being here and giving us your time, your questions, and your input. And if you need Patty's email address, it is patty@hashicorp.com.
I can't promise that I will always reply to every email or do so in a timely manner, but you're welcome to reach out and I will read all of them. It is not a great place to ask for it's not a great place for bug reports, asking for prioritization of bug reports, or asking questions that could be in the Discuss forum, because I'm not going to lie, those are unlikely to get answered or have outcomes taken on them. Not because I'm mad or I don't like you, but because I lose track of things if they don't go through like the channels we've set up for them. My brain can't focus on them anymore.
And likewise, my email is katie@hashicorp.com. And yes, please send me your thoughts, especially around acceptance testing, which is something I'm working on at the moment.
Awesome homework for all you provider developers. Join us a month from now. For now, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Patty, for being here once again. And with that, have a great rest of your Thursday, early Friday, depending on where you are, Thursday lunchtime, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Happy terraforming.